If you went to school in India like me, you probably learned about the British Raj, the partition of 1947, the creation of Pakistan, and maybe the 1971 war that led to the birth of Bangladesh. What most of us didn't learn is that until 1931, the Indian Empire included what we now know as Myanmar, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Nepal, Pakistan, and even parts of the Gulf, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, and the UAE. I certainly didn't until I read Shattered Lands, 5 Partitions and the Making of Modern Asia by Sam Dalrymple. It's a book that connects so many dots, showing how the boundaries drawn then still shape politics, identity, and even conflicts today, though these roots rarely make it into mainstream conversations. Every chapter offered a new look at Asia, its alliances, migrations, and memories, and made me rethink what I learned in school. With this conversation, I hope to spark the same curiosity in you. Let's get into it. Sam, welcome to the reading list.
Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad we could finally make this happen. You're sitting right there. And now we're going to talk about your beautiful book.
Amazing. That's good.
Perfect. So, to get us started, I would like for you to introduce our listeners and viewers to Shattered Lands.
Sure. So Shattered Lands is a book about basically the fact that what we imagine the Raj to look like, what we imagine British India to look like, is essentially wrong. We have this image in our heads of British India being roughly equivalent to India and modern-day Pakistan. But in fact, it was a far larger entity. Everyone in this enormous expanse from what's now southern Yemen to modern-day Burma was all part of this kind of colony within a colony known as the Indian Empire. So that you had a Yemeni Jewish woman trying to migrate to Jerusalem in the 1920s had to go on an Indian passport by virtue of her being born in Yemen. She was legally an Indian. And it's the story of how through 5 partitions over 5 decades, this single mega colony that contains a quarter of the world's population is transformed into 12 different nation states. Everything from Yemen, Oman, the UAE, Dubai, etc., Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Burma, Myanmar. And so in quick order, it's the partition of Burma in 1937, the partition of the Arabian states from India in 1937 to 47, the Great Partition that we all know about of 47, but then also what I call the partition of princely India, the way in which 80% of the modern-day India-Pakistan border was formed by these princely states choosing themselves which country to join. And so this is a separate process, in a sense, from the Hindu-Muslim divide that happens elsewhere. And then the final partition, the 5th partition, is Bangladesh's independence from Pakistan and the creation of the 12th nation state from what was once one British colony called India.
The book is massive and so expansive in not just the geography, but also the events that you're recording for us. But I really want to know what the inspiration for Shattered Lands is.
So very simply, it came from a conversation that I had just before COVID. I was working on partition oral research. And I was chatting to someone from Tripura, Mizoram, kind of borderlands. And we were having this conversation about how partition affected that region. Huge numbers of Hindu refugees from what's now Bangladesh fled there at various times. And when I asked, how did partition affect your area? He said, which one? Was it 1937 when Burma was separated from us and we had a border on that side? Was it 1947? Or was it 1971 when Bangladesh became independent and we had yet another wave of refugees suddenly enter our areas? And so it suddenly got me thinking about how different partition looks in that region, but particularly this strange realization that Burma, which is always on those maps of British India that you see, but you never really question it. You never really think, why is Burma there? And I think a lot of people imagine that it's kind of, administratively there. But the fact is that in the 1930s, you had numerous Burmese nationalists who considered themselves Indian nationalists and were part of the Indian National Congress. And the more that I began to look at what the Raj actually was in the 1920s, the more surprised I was. The fact that Dubai was a part of the Raj is something that growing up in Delhi, we're never told. The fact that India's westernmost city for almost 100 years was the city of Aden in what's now Yemen. And the fact that there was a world in which this entire region, in a sense, gets independence from Britain, not just the kind of individual nation states that we have today.
So you've been working on something called Project Dastaan for a while, which is an oral history project. I want us to talk a little bit about that and also how Project Dastaan then affected your work with the book.
Sure. So Project Dastaan, I think we founded with my co-founders Spara Shahuja and Sadia Gardezi and Amina Malik way back in 2018, I think, with a little help from a certain Anshul Malhotra. The idea was, it came out of this strange revelation, in a sense, that, there we were sitting in the UK, able to have conversations between Indians and Pakistanis easily. And, Sparsha's ancestral home falls in what's now Pakistan, about 2 hours from Islamabad. And for him, it was this kind of lost homeland. And yet for Sadia, it was a 2-hour drive. And likewise, Amina would speak kind of with longing about the city of Hoshiarpur in India that, Sparsh had never even considered driving off to. He was just like, what's that?
Yeah.
But for her, it was this deep, meaningful thing. Mm-hmm. And so what we were doing was we would interview partition families and then reconnect them through virtual reality. These virtual reality goggles transport these families back to their ancestral homes and communities, and try to reconnect them with long-lost friends, long-lost, maybe neighbours. In one case, we managed to reconnect someone with, the family who'd saved their life in 1947. So we were doing that from about 2018 until around 2022, and I think it's hugely informed my book. I mean, this book would not exist were it not for that project kind of suddenly consuming my life, and I think making me appreciate just how different the reality of partition's effects on the subcontinent are from the one that I grew up with in Delhi. I think I grew up with a very Punjab-centric view of partition, and the fact that, there were 3 times more refugees fleeing to Pakistan from what's now Telangana in South India than were generated in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. Shows the extraordinary scale at which this affected the entire subcontinent, but in ways that we're only beginning to scratch the surface of. The fact that the state in India that was most demographically affected by partition was Tripura in northeast India, which was previously majority Adivasi and then became majority Bengali. And this has created huge tensions in the state, and yet again is never spoken about in regard to how we imagine partition. And so it was these sorts of questions, wanting a more holistic view, I guess, of how these ruptures have affected both the landscape, but also psyches and the geopolitics of the region. And the more that you begin to see these connections, the more that you just, see them absolutely everywhere.
I can't imagine the old people with VR goggles. Were they really heavy for them?
That was fine. There was definitely one of the things that we had to do was we realized quite early that old people will get a lot more motion sickness in the VR.
Yeah.
So the VR, although we initially planned all these kind of, virtual reality tracking shots, putting them on gimbals, etc., eventually we realized that the best thing was just to place these VR cameras on tripods and leave them in a certain area so that these old people could sit in one place and take in the surroundings themselves, moving their heads. But yeah, the motion thing was the thing that I think was the most difficult with people in their 90s.
What an unexpected finding.
Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned Sparsh's family history, which is what sparked your interest in partition. But your family also has a legacy with the empire, right? So throughout your work in oral histories of the partition and then also your research, how were you grappling with your own heritage and the heritage of the Raj and the partition and the events of today?
No, that's a very good question. So my family is basically mostly Scottish, but Anglo-Indian on both sides of the family. So dad's got a tiny bit of Bengali, mum's got a tiny bit of Haryanvi. And both their families were out here at various different points during the Raj. But more recently, on my dad's side, my grandfather, we found out, had been here as a 19-year-old. So one of the strange discoveries that whilst I was doing Project Dastaan, I was going around interviewing all these families about their partition stories. it was the day before my grandfather's funeral that we started going through his old diaries and his old photo albums, literally just before the funeral, after his passing. And we suddenly found all of these photos of him as a young soldier who'd been brought in during World War II.
Oh my God.
In Meroli, him standing in front of the Qutb Minar. And despite the fact that my family's been living in Delhi since 1989, he had never come out to visit us, and it always remained a mystery to us why he'd never come out. It was only through going through his letters that it basically emerged that he'd put all of his friends on a train and they'd never made it to the other side. And the sort of family understanding, although we have no evidence of this, of course, because we never got to ask him, but was that basically he didn't want to come out and visit us ever because of these traumas. It was always like a new excuse. Where every time that we asked why he wasn't coming out to visit us. But yes, of course, it creates a huge sort of interesting thing to grapple with. Both, I'm someone who's grown up in Delhi. I've moved here I've lived here since I was 6 years old. And yet very much my family comes from the country that, ruled this country and colonized this country. And there is a huge amount of deeply disturbing history involved that I think particularly in Britain is largely misunderstood or kind of, brushed over. I think India's been a lovely country, a lovely sort of, warm and welcoming country despite this history. But I do think that much like in Ireland, India definitely feels that, like insulted whenever you get these people coming from Britain who don't know this history, who don't know the history of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, for example. Yeah. It's appalling how few Brits understand the legacy of partition today and Britain's implication within that. And so I think it's an important thing to try and grapple with and own up to. Yeah.
Or anytime somebody who's European asks an Indian, why you speak English?
There we go.
Because of you. Yeah, that's fair. Okay, so you've worked across multiple languages and multiple oral traditions now. What was this experience like? And was there any surprising or one of your most favorite moments that you came across?
That's really interesting. So yeah, for Project Dastaan, we were working in English, Hindi and Urdu, which I can all sort of work in. And then there was also Punjabi and Bengali that friends were working in. Then for the book, I tried even more languages. So there's some Arabic sources, some Burmese sources, Konyak sources. There's, I think, 8 different languages that I've tried to use in the book. I think one of the clearest examples of how, interviews in different languages can change how we perceive history is on the India-Myanmar border in Nagaland. I was going there asking about that border and the experience of living there. And if you read any English language sources or Hindi language sources, it's always, the border was drawn by a bunch of British officials in 1937, April, on the basis of a treaty that had been established in the 1820s. If you ask anyone in Konyak, which is one of the kind of languages of Nagaland, northern Nagaland, they will say that the border was drawn in 1962 after an agreement by Jawaharlal Nehru and UNU of Burma. And this is because until that point, many people in the Konyak regions had no idea that they were living in what was defined as a borderland by Rangoon and Delhi. It had been drawn up by colonial officials in the 1930s, but no one had ever told them. And so it's very interesting how, again, and that would be different in Nagamese or, the languages more around Kohima. You'd get a different answer, which is probably more to do with 1937. But specifically Konyak, there's this wide understanding that it was a much later fact because that's when the border began to be experienced as a border.
That's really interesting. And that is clearly not something I knew. So thank you for that. In your book, you argue that the British Empire was partitioned 5 times, not once like we know in our imagination right now. So why is it so important for us to start talking about the separation of this empire in a wider context beyond just 1947 or 1971?
I think that each of these partitions have in effect affected each other like a domino effect. So it's impossible to understand 1947 without understanding that earlier, the founders of Pakistan based the idea of establishing Pakistan on the earlier establishment of Burma. Rahmat Ali Chaudhry, who comes up with the name Pakistan, says it makes no sense to me why, if Burma is to be separated from India, then the Muslims of India must be forced into an Indian union. And I think that these other separations, the separation of Burma, the separation of Arabia, explains so much about the world in which we live in. So, for example, the Rohingya genocide that took place just a few years ago. Burma is it only makes sense in the context of Burma's separation from India. In 1937, Burma is separated as a result of growing kind of anti-immigration fears. The whole debate around separating Burma feels very like the debates around Brexit. Is immigration good or bad to us? Burma had become one of the epicenters of migration from across the Indian Empire, and Rangoon had famously become a majority Tamil and Bengali city. And it's as a result of that you get a series of anti-immigration politicians voted into power, notably U Saw, who, in an attempt to kick out all of the Indian communities, also basically creates a register of which communities are indigenous to Burma and which need to be forced out. One of those he chooses to be forced out are the Rohingya, on the basis that they speak a dialect closely related to Bengali, and regardless of the fact that they'd been living there for at least about 700, if not 1,000 years. And so, we only understand these conflicts, which, obviously continue to affect Indian politics today, if we understand the events that surrounded these stories. Likewise, Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in the Gulf War only makes sense if we understand these other partitions. And it's also interesting to sort of compare some of these conflicts. So, for example, conflicts in Kashmir, in Balochistan, and in Manipur all have their origins in this whole story of what would happen to the princely states of the Raj, this fourth partition. And it's only through comparing them and understanding this as a separate process that we begin to see the similarities in each of these cases and each of the separatist movements that would emerge thereafter.
So we still have older Indians who have memories of living in these parts of the empire that are not connected to India anymore, right? You still have people who have roots or memories of living in Aden, of living in Myanmar, Burma then. But as a collective, Indian history has kind of forgotten these parts, right? Why do you think that is?
I think that the trauma of the Great Partition in 1947 was so all-encompassing that when the history books were written after independence, they very much privileged that rupture over the others. So, I think it's noteworthy that the major migrations of these earlier partitions were not ones that affected Delhi so much, were not ones who affected the people who were writing the textbooks. And so, most people who migrated back from Burma in 1937 or 1940s would move to Bengal and Tamil Nadu. Most of the people who migrated back from the Gulf states after the Gulf states were separated would move to Gujarat and Maharashtra, notably the Ambani family. And so, I think that it's not incidental that Delhi was not at the focus, but I also think that it's about it's to do with the way that the textbooks were written to privilege certain narratives. And I think after independence, there was this very much an effort to show India as this kind of cohesive nation that has existed since time immemorial. So, as I think we're going to go on to talk about later, this idea of undivided India was very central to the way that textbooks were written. The fact that, since the time of the Mahabharata, undivided India has stretched from Sindh to Assam and from Kashmir to Kanyakumari. And in fact, a unified political state only encompassed those borders for 5 months in the course of 1947. And before that, it had either been a bunch of different states or, under the British, had extended all the way into Arabia and Burma. And it's interesting to see how these narratives emerge, in a sense.
So let's talk about undivided India now. Where did that myth come about from?
So the idea of Bharat has existed for over 3,000 years. It's a very ancient idea that is, first comes into its full conception in the Mahabharata, right? The idea of this sacred geography linked by a series of pilgrimage routes and linked by a shared heritage of having participated in the great Battle of Kurukshetra. But, that land had, whilst being revered as a kind of, as a sacred landscape, had never been politically unified thereafter. But in the course of the 19th and early 20th century, numerous nationalists who were beginning to imagine what could look like after the British leave, begin to discuss that maybe rather than just inheriting all of the places that Britain had conquered, Bharat Varsh might be a more suitable basis for forging a nation state. And so it's interesting how in the 1920s, when Gandhi goes out to Burma, Burma's most popular politician at the time, Mahatma Uttama, who was himself an acolyte of Gandhi, spends years trying to campaign for Burma to be seen as an integral part of Indian identity and not be separated. That was actually the most popular nationalist demand in Burma at the time. And it's Gandhi, and in particular various Hindu nationalist groups, who actively petitioned to separate off Burma and Arabia so as to make India resemble Bharat more. So it's an interesting and rather unexpected process. And it's that creation of Bharat in some sense and the removal of the Burmese and the Arabian states that begins to worry figures like Jinnah.
So the book paints a very vivid picture in how maps and cartography played a very important role in how villages came about, what families stayed together and how they split. Is there any personal stories that you came about in your research that really stuck with you throughout this?
I think that the story that probably most affected me was the story of my co-founder, Sparsh, and his family. His family had grown up in a town called Bela in what's now Pakistan. And in 1947, they had been vaguely aware of these demands for Pakistan and Hindustan, but they'd been sort of something battled out in far off Delhi and not really something that had affected their area of Punjab that much. And then suddenly there began to be kind of worry that things were changing. And then one day his family were forced out by basically a kind of a mob that showed up from outside of the village. Crucially, Sparsh's family was saved and hidden in a barn by their Muslim neighbor. And I think that the reason that this affected me so much was because of the way that it was the driving force behind Project Dastaan and my entry into this whole story in some sense. But also because later, me and Sparsh managed to both get visas to Pakistan, cross over, and firstly found his old ancestral home, but also found the family of Sher Khan, who was the man who'd saved his family's life. And the bridging of that border and the fact that we were able to meet this family who had existed in the stories within his family, but suddenly quite vividly see the family who'd saved his life was something that was very emotional and
I can
wonderful.
imagine, but also how lucky to be able to have found your ancestral home.
Exactly.
It's still standing.
Yeah, well, so that it wasn't still standing, but the plot of land where it had been was still there, and you could still see that, and the plot of land where they'd farmed and that kind of thing was still there.
Oh wow! Is he still in touch with them?
They were on a WhatsApp group.
All of them?
All of them. The village now has a WhatsApp group, and they're trying to get him to come back to Pakistan
how nice.
Celebrate Eid or something.
How sweet!
Yeah, it's adorable.
I know in your acknowledgements at the end of your book, in your epilogue, you write about his grandfather teaching him how to tie the turban.
Yeah.
And when he gets there, there's obviously a photo, but when he gets there and it's like, oh, it's so outdated.
It's like arriving into central London in a kind of top hat and a walking stick from the 1930s, and saying like, oh, this is what we used to wear here, and of course times have changed and no one's wearing those turbans anymore.
But I found that so heartwarming that there's something there's something to be said about your grandfather passing down something that he learned from his parents and his grandparents to you, even if it's outdated, to be able to connect with that and to go there and be like, proudly have that outdated headdress on you and be like, this is mine. I'm sure that was really special for him.
It was, and I think also just what was lovely was the fact that Isha was on this WhatsApp group with his old neighbours, reconnected after 78 years, and was still chatting to the old neighbours about kind of, you know, a couple of weeks before he finally passed away. And so they'd kind of, even though they never met again, they continue chatting, occasionally video called.
Sweet. Isha is his grandfather?
Is his grandfather.
Okay, that's lovely. That's so sweet. Talking about now not so sweet parts of the partition did, not just the partition of India and Pakistan, but all of our other subsequent partitions, did also create the concept of statelessness, both on the Punjabi side and on the Bengali and Burmese side. And a lot of those conflicts and those experiences still live on in people, with, I think the most recent one written in the book is the Bahris of Bangladesh, right? Can we talk about that a little? How did the concept of belonging and not belonging come about?
So I think after each of these partitions, nation states raced to define who belonged in these new nation states and who didn't, but they often weren't in communication with each other. So just with the example of the Bahris were largely Urdu speakers who had migrated to what's now Bangladesh, was then East Pakistan, after the first partition, or the third Great Partition. And in 1971, because they spoke Urdu, they were often considered collaborators with the Pakistani army, regardless of whether or not they had actually collaborated. But the fact that they spoke the same language as the West Pakistani army meant that they were often seen in that way. And after Bangladesh gets its independence, the Bangladeshi government says, okay, all of you guys have to go off to Pakistan, that's where you belong. But then the government of West Pakistan says, well, these guys have never lived in West Pakistan. These guys migrated from Bihar to Dhaka. And so, yes, once again, you get one of the largest statelessness crises in the world, until I think it was finally resolved this decade.
2008,
just over a decade ago. If we look at the Rohingya crisis, that was very much based over whether the Rohingya should belong to India, Bangladesh, or Myanmar. And what's fascinating is that the reason that the Myanmar government gets so worried about the Rohingya in the first place, and it begins to become a big thing in the military eyes, is because many of them in the 1940s had been Pakistani nationalists. Today, because Pakistan is to the west of India and Myanmar is off to the east, we often don't associate them. And understanding this only makes sense when we understand the various partitions that have ruptured their way through the landscape.
And the roots of the Rohingya crisis come from political decisions of, I guess, categorizing people based on their racial identities and ethnic identities, all the way back in Burmese politics, right?
Exactly. And I think likewise, there are so many conflicts that we don't associate with partition, and yet are intimately tied to it. So, for example, it's very interesting looking at the origins of Naga separatism and the Naga independence movement. It begins as a movement to reunify the Nagas stuck in India from the ones stuck in Burma, because a border ruptures its way through the Naga communities. And it was very much seen at the time in Nagaland as a movement to reunify the Naga people, rather than as one to necessarily divide it from the central Indian state. And again, the language that people use to talk about these conflicts is often misunderstood, I think.
It was really heartbreaking to read about the Naga struggle throughout the book, because it starts and it's mentioned across different chapters and different movements, but the end of that movement, or kind of, I guess, you're fading away, right? It's not the end. There's still people who have those sentiments, but the fading away of that movement, it just happens. I guess there's no decisions that are taken. Like, the Indian state doesn't really know what to make of their call for separatism. And the leader of that movement, when you write about how he died, can we talk about that a little?
Fizo is, I think, one of the characters that I was most surprised with when researching the book, because he just shows up everywhere.
Yeah.
And in all sorts of unexpected places that I think, like most history books, the Naga separatist movement is kind of peripheral to all these main events. And yet Fiso is right there centrally in the discussions of separating Burma. He's then joins the INA and is there alongside Subhas Chandra Bose throughout that whole period of history. He goes back to Burma with ideas forged in Burma that, you know, we are not Indians and thus should be someone else. And he has this idea that the Nagas are separate. Tries to reunify people across the border, as I said. But then shows up again in the 1950s because he tries to make contact with the Pakistani army. And what we often forget is that after partition, after the first war over Kashmir, in the 1950s, tensions between India and Pakistan really begin to calm down. You get joint passports, which we always forget about. Pakistan lets an Indian Muslim from Bombay build Jinnah's tomb, and Jinnah's daughter, Dina, will remain in Bombay for the rest of her life. I think Zulfikar Ali Bhutto keeps his Indian passport as late as the 1958 or something.
Wow.
And so there's all of these connections. RAW and the ISI, or their predecessors, are sharing intelligence and working together to combat communist revolution in Myanmar in a way that we've completely forgotten, and yet is like a bit like kind of Pathan or something, you know, with like Shah Rukh Khan and Deepika Padukone fighting alongside one another. It's this kind of crazy story that really should be in a film. And yet that all seems to break apart in the early 1960s. And one of the reasons for that, in response to India taking over Goa in the liberation of Goa, Pakistan's army begins to worry that India's, you know, showing more military might, and begins to extend military support not to Kashmiri separatists, but to Fiso and the Naga movement. And so, you know, the Naga movement again is right there at the center of the story of modern day India and Pakistan. And again, it continues all the way through to 71, where when the Indian army go into Dhaka, finally in 1971, who do they find hiding out in the ISI safe houses but all these Nagas? And so it's a story that kind of rears its head in so many interesting ways that I think before I began researching the book, I had no conception of.
So many questions, but first we're going to talk about the joint passports. What were they?
These joint passports were basically made in the 1950s, and I think were only ended in the wake of the 65 war. But were basically for people who would constantly migrate across this border to see their old families and etc. A lot of people did manage to maintain, after partition, some sort of connection with the other side. And for the first 15 years or so, that was just regarded as somewhat normal. And it's only in the wake of the 65 war that suddenly both countries, India and Pakistan, enact enemy property acts. And basically begin to criminalize cross-border contacts. And so suddenly it becomes, rather than the norm to maintain contacts with your childhood home, etc., it suddenly becomes much more difficult to move across that border. But I think that we often assume everything happened at once in 1947, and the fact is that throughout the 50s, there's so much interesting stuff going on, where kind of, I think there's a moment where Nehru lands in Karachi in the late 50s to cries of Nehru Zindabad, which again does not feature in our depiction of how, India and Pakistan's relationship went. There's a really good book, two good books that came out on this subject, the fact that we've completely misunderstood the 1950s in the subcontinent. One is Avinash Paliwal's India's Near East, and then the other one is Animosity at Bay, Pallavi Raghavan. And both of them basically talk about how the relationship between India and Pakistan in the 50s was kind of the high point.
Wow.
And we've completely forgotten that.
Clearly, I knew nothing of that because you can see my reaction. But from there then, how do we come to this point where both the countries are sponsoring and training separatist movements across their borders? So this is one of the very interesting bits, and I mentioned Avinash Paliwal's book earlier. I think he was the first person to realize that actually, I think he did this during COVID or something, basically realizing that actually
all of the early documents from India's side, at least, they're still locked up in Pakistan, but a huge number of intelligence files regarding cross-border sponsorship of groups, everyone from the Nagas to, India's sponsorship of Bengali separatists in Pakistan or Balochi separatists had been declassified. About 10 years ago, and had never been announced, and it was just sitting there in just near Rashtrapati Bhavan in the National Archives.
Oh my gosh.
And because 80 years has passed, and all of these archives have to go under the eyes of various bureaucrats, and if they're not deemed to go against India's national security, then I think it's after 50 years they're given to the public and handed over to the National Archives. And so all this stuff had been sitting there, but no one had really gone into it in depth. And Avinash Paliwal's book, India's Near East, very much talks about this. And it's something that I've used a lot for this book. How in the wake of India going into Goa and the liberation of Goa, Ayub Khan extends funding to Naga separatists. In response to this, around the same time, you have the first Bengali, specifically Mujibur Rahman, seems to have crossed over to Tripura and made contact with various members of the Indian intelligence establishment. It remains very contentious exactly what was going on. It does seem that he wasn't necessarily seeking outright independence, and when Nehru contacts him, it seems that he's actually trying to encourage Mujib to become president of Pakistan as a whole, and not to basically lead a movement for a separatist movement. But Pakistan's intelligence machinery does think that that's what he's doing, and so begins to fund the Mizo separatist struggle. It's in response to this that India seems to reach out to Balochi and Pashto separatists, and by the in the course of just a few years in the 1960s, we have a very clear paper trail of this kind of tit-for-tat sponsorship of separatists, again, that until very late includes no stuff in Kashmir. Or maybe those just haven't been released yet. But India and Pakistan by the late 60s are having all sorts of proxy wars in the northeast. And it's all happening in the northeast. And that's the kind of epicenter of all of this secret diplomacy. But it's really interesting. And again, all of this was just lying in the National Archives waiting to be unearthed until Avinash discovered them about 5 years ago.
Wow. Who can access them and how?
Any scholars in Delhi. So again, there's a whole second half of the story is waiting to be unearthed in the archives of Islamabad, but they are mostly difficult to access for international scholars. But anyone from India or from, scholars abroad can basically, you need letters of approval and the normal, series of documents proving that you're a research scholar. But then you just go to the National Archives, get approval, and you can call these things up. A lot of it even is digitized on a website called Abhilekh Patal that has recently, the government of India has been trying to digitize a huge number of the documents contained within the archives. And so you can just, a lot of this I was doing in COVID, just, going on the website and seeing these files, seeing reports from various bureaucrats on what they've been hearing, and it's very interesting. Mm-hmm. Likewise, you can get a lot more in the British National Archives in Kew in London, which are what less to do with India and Pakistan's kind of internal stuff, but what British diplomats are hearing back in London, because a lot of there's still a lot of British mediation in the India and Pakistan dispute in the 1950s and 60s. So a lot of stuff is sent, and that stuff is all available in London as well. So there's really interesting new work, I think, still to be done. I think that Avinash has only scratched the surface in a sense, and I think there's going to be a huge slew of new revelations waiting to be unearthed.
Wow.
And I think the 50s and 60s are hugely underrepresented. I think there's a huge amount of research in the kind of, in the freedom movement and then in 71 and after. But I think the 50s and 60s is still kind of remarkably virgin territory for scholars. And there's a huge amount of revelations waiting to be unearthed.
Oh my God, I'm looking forward to those books. That's going to be so interesting. So I want us to talk a little bit about the Gulf now, because I found it so fascinating when in Shattered Lands you start reading and all of a sudden you're like, Dubai was a part of India, Oman was a part of India, and obviously this is before the oil boom, but they used to use the Indian rupee. They were governed or administered by the Indian civil service. Can we talk about that a little?
it's the kind of crazy bit of the book that's definitely, I think, garnered the most press and surprised people the most. Because I think it's not just the Indian state narratives that it's been written out of, it's also very much ignored in most of the Gulf, and it's only really in Yemeni books that this story begins to emerge.
Oh, wow.
So yes, if you went back 100 years ago today, this kind of arc of the Arabian Peninsula, basically everything in the Arabian Peninsula other than Saudi Arabia and North Yemen, was all part of the Raj. And in fact, the reason that these states like Qatar, Bahrain, Dubai were not absorbed by Saudi Arabia in the 20s when Ibn Saud went to unite all the tribes of Arabia, it was because of the Indian Army's protection that these states were not absorbed into Saudi Arabia. So they're really kind of absorbed into the Raj rather than as separate colonial territories in 1903 when Lord Curzon has a darbar in what's now Sharjah. And in the aftermath, you suddenly get all these sheikhs and sultans being treated as princely states. Actually, if you go to the Al-Qabnama, which is the standard list of princely states of the Indian government, so, the princely states like Jaipur, Jodhpur, Hyderabad, Kashmir, these semi-independent kingdoms that had given over their foreign policy and defence to Britain, but otherwise were mostly internally independent. It actually opens this list alphabetically with Abu Dhabi and goes on to list all the others. And in the aftermath of this, you gradually get all of the elites of these states becoming, in a sense, more Indian. So the sultans of Oman are all educated in Mayo College, Rajasthan, where they become more fluent in Urdu than they are in Arabic.
Wow.
Much of the aristocracy of what's now Eastern Yemen, particularly the Hadramaut states, marry into the Nizam of Hyderabad's family. And so you get Dakhni Urdu being the state language of Eastern Yemen. And probably the biggest bit of culture that remains with us today is Halim. Halim is a Yemeni dish where they added basically Telugu spices. So it's Yemeni harissa that was made by these Yemeni sultans in Hyderabad for Hyderabadi audience, and where the cooks began to add all of these local spices that were different from what's now Yemen. And so there's this whole relationship that evolved. What's important, though, is that in the Gulf states, 99% of people never particularly felt Indian. If you asked someone in Dubai what they felt Khaliji, like from the Gulf, right? And it's only in the city of Aden, which was directly ruled British India. It wasn't a princely state. It was part of Bombay province.
Wow.
And directly ruled from Bombay. In Aden, you get this whole generation in the 1910s and 20s. You do get a generation of Arabs who begin to consider themselves as Indian nationalists. Most notably, there's this guy called Muhammad Ali Luqman. Luqman is this brilliant, one of the founding fathers of modern Yemen. Except in his early days, he's an Indian nationalist going on road trips with Ambedkar and becoming Gandhi's main Arabic translator during Gandhi's, speeches for the Congress in Aden. Again, we forget that there was a local Congress kind of, section open in what's now southern Yemen. And yet, the name Aden shows up so much. I think it's Bose is imprisoned there briefly. You get constantly people being sent there, but no one really pieces it all together. You do get this generation of Arabs considering themselves Indian nationalists, but it begins to diverge, particularly once Gandhi begins saying we want our nation to resemble Bharat. And at the same time, you get the beginnings of Arab nationalism, particularly coming from the Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, but then later, Nasser's Egypt begins having these kind of Arab nationalist radios that people across the Gulf begin to listen to. So by the 1960s, you actually get huge numbers of laws passed in the Gulf, basically ensuring that only Arabs can get citizenship in these countries.
Wow.
And a lot of the Gujarati or Sindhi or Balochi communities are basically sent back to India or Pakistan. But to this day, one of the most popular surnames in Oman is Al-Baluchi, which is Balochi. And to this day, Oman has the only Hindu sheikh in the Arabian Peninsula, Mr. Kimji, who is Sheikh al-Banyan, which is like Sheikh of the Banya tribe, because Banyas, Gujarati Banyas, have since been labelled since the 80s, I think, as an indigenous tribe to Oman because their presence goes back so far.
Oh
so there's
my
a Hindu
God.
sheikh in modern day Oman that we completely forget about. So they were always Kutchi speaking. Obviously now they are far more Omani, and they will speak Arabic probably more fluently than they will Gujarati or Kutchi.
So then it's very important and interesting to think about the nature of the Hinduism that they would be practicing. I'm sure it's impacted and influenced more by the cultures around them.
Yes, I guess the key point is that we tend to assume that South Asia's relationship with the Gulf is one that basically begins with oil and begins with the kind of, migrant workers moving there in the kind of 80s and 90s, the rise of Dubai, etc. That is not the full story, and there's a much more historic. I mean, even long before the Raj ever tied them under one political banner, there had long been trade back and forth. You had there's all these small bits of history that we've completely forgotten and excised from our mind.
Well, you learn something new every day. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Arabian Raj now, because that's what came about once the British Indian Raj fell down, right? Where did the term come about, and how did it eventually also dissolve?
So, the Gulf states are part of India until the 1930s is when there begin to be serious proposals about separating the Gulf states off from the Raj. Aden and the protectorates that will later become Yemen are separated off in April Fool's Day in 1937. But the rest of the Gulf remains a part of India until April 1947.
Okay.
But there's this bizarre telegram that I managed to find from the legation in Tehran, the British legation in Tehran, who were dealing with the future of the Gulf. And they write that it was with surprising unanimity amongst government of India officials that there was absolutely no interest in running the Gulf after independence. So Indian officials who were about to take over in Delhi basically turned down running this region. So there is a future where these states were integrated into either India or Pakistan in much the same way as Jaipur, Kashmir, Hyderabad, etc. But that's not the case, and instead all of these states are moved to the British Colonial Office and basically run from two new residencies, one in Aden and one in Bahrain. And this is what will become known as the Arabian Raj. So it's this kind of, I think when David Holden visits, who is this journalist, very important in the book, has, since the book comes out, has been unearthed as a CIA KGB double agent, which is kind of wild, because I was going through all of his papers, and suddenly there's all, like, he showed up in the news a few months ago. I'm like, what the hell? So that wild new revelation aside, which definitely I would have included, it's not in the book, but maybe in next editions.
I think it may be in a footnote.
Yeah, I mention in a footnote that there is a sealed CIA file which hints at his relations with several spy agencies, but it had not been unearthed that he worked for both the CIA and the KGB, which again
he had some amazing experiences.
But when he visits in the 1950s, he explicitly talks about, it was the last place where the Raj was still active in some sense, and that visiting Bahrain, British Protectorate Bahrain, was in a sense the last vestige of the British Raj, much like, Pondicherry was the last vestige of French India, or Goa was the last vestige of Portuguese India. And so it's this kind of strange thing where he basically describes all of the rituals of the Raj continued in Bahrain and Dubai and Oman right through the 1960s. And it only begins to change around basically the mid-1960s in response to Arab nationalism. Britain pulls out of all of its colonies east of Aden, and there's this big, east of Suez basically, and there's this big move away from empire. Interestingly, the same month that Britain finally pulls out of the Arabian Raj is the moment that it joins a new economic union called the European Union. And so, yeah, like, again, these
Can't stay
ties
away.
are, yeah.
Just needs to be a part of that collective. Okay. So you've had the privilege of going into Myanmar to do research for the book as well. Specifically in Myanmar, are there still any remnants of its history and ties with India there?
Massive. So just, I was there in January most recently. And if you walk around downtown Yangon, although none of them have their original names, you can get the guide of old Rangoon, right, which is still sold in the bookshops. And it takes you around all these buildings that used to be, Bengal State Bank, the kind of, Indus Ind. All of these banks that we're used to in Delhi is suddenly there too. You've got the governor's house, which was, had the crests of the different provinces of India emblazoned on it. So you have the symbol for Punjab, Bombay, Madras, Assam, Balochistan, Sindh, etc., all emblazoned on the walls. And yeah, you can see it everywhere. I think that it's somewhat surprising, but it shouldn't be, that even the vocabulary, so what the slur used against the Rohingya today is Chetty, which is Chettiar, because the biggest landed group in colonial Burma were the Chettiars, who were the bankers whose loans had underwritten the entire agricultural expansion of Burma. So today you can go to Chettinad and you see all those lovely Burmese teak mansions. That was the slur against Indians, essentially, and is still used against the Rohingya to this day. And yeah, I think there's so many ways. I think I had a 4-minute walk from the Sule Pagoda this January, and we passed through first the largest synagogue of Kolkata Jews, passed through the Chola Dargah, which was for basically Tamil Muslims, to a massive Andhra Hindu temple. We then walked through to the main Gurdwara in town.
Oh my God.
And then on and on it would go. And I think it's always there hiding in plain sight, just like, no one asks why everyone's grandparents know how to cook khao. And, there's that old Bollywood song that we all know, Mera Piya Gaye Rangoon, that is one of the classics of the era, but why is the Piya going off to Rangoon?
Oh my God, I haven't thought about that song in such a long time.
It's such a great song.
I'm going to listen to it on my way home now. Oh, wow. That's insanely fascinating. And I really hope I have the privilege of going there one day.
It feels almost exactly like Kolkata. It's like I've never been to another city that felt more like Kolkata. Even Dhaka doesn't feel as similar to Kolkata as Yangon.
Wow. Let's go. Next family
Let's
trip.
go. Let's go.
Done. Okay, we're staying in the contemporary world now, and I'm taking us to the UK. Britain once ruled over the largest interconnected expanse of land, right? And then it didn't. All these borders were made, all of these countries come out of that. But Britain today itself is also experiencing an identity crisis, a migrant crisis, and what seems like a crisis of belonging, right? What can Britain and British people today learn from the history and the legacy that they have left behind across the globe?
I think that Kavita Puri's done amazing work on how central this should be to Britain in a way that it's not taught. But the more I go around Britain, the more that every British family too has some sort of connection. I don't think, for example, it's incidental that the main South Asian communities, the South Asian communities that exist in Britain today and are the hallmarks of its diversity are not representative of South Asia as a whole. You have very few Kannada speakers or Marathi speakers or Balochi speakers. The main communities are Bengalis, Punjabis, Gujaratis, Sindhis, and Kashmiris. Mm-hmm. And that's a direct result of the fact that these are the communities that were displaced in partition. And when Britain began opening its borders to try and rebuild Britain in the aftermath of the Blitz, it was these communities who'd already lost their homes and felt, what more have we got to lose than to migrate across the sea? Mm-hmm. And so I think that it's a huge part of numerous British families to this day, South Asian origin or not. And I think that Britain is currently in this delusion that not being able to understand its own kind of ethnic diversity, which is a direct result of British imperialism across the globe. And it's only possible to understand Britain's place in the world if you understand and why the British economy is not what it was 100 years ago, if you don't understand that Britain 100 years ago ruled a quarter of the world's population. Yeah. And I think that there's this kind of severe lack of conversation about this in Britain. Of course, Britain's internal ethnic diversity goes long back beyond even then. I was recently reading about the British Roman governor, the first Roman governor of Scotland, where I'm from, was of Algerian origin. And so we had there were Algerians in Scotland before the first Anglo-Saxons began sailing across the sea in small boats.
Wow.
as kind of, as migrants.
Yeah.
But I think Britain is having this huge identity crisis and these kind of absolutely ridiculous debates about immigration, etc., that are utterly disconnected from its path. I think that Britain is growing to some extent more aware of this history. So when I began Project Dastaan, there were still no textbooks mentioning partition. That has changed as a result of several pressure groups, etc. You now can, as a key Stage 3 history student, study, the history of the British Empire. But it's remarkable that that wasn't there. That is arguably the most important thing that Britain has ever done worldwide, ruling a quarter of its population. It's a bizarre omission.
Yeah.
And there's still, though, more history books that will talk about, the Tudors and the origin of the Catholic-Protestant divide than there are on British imperial history, which is bizarre.
But you see that changing in there.
I see that changing.
I mean, that it has to change. They don't have any other option, right? So my last question for you as we close this interview and go into a rapid fire is, you've traveled across countries, across archives, spoken to a vast diversity of people for the book while you're researching it. But what has Shattered Lands and the people that you interacted with taught you about human resilience?
Yeah, I think it's amazing to see. I mean, in each of these partitions, there are huge numbers of people displaced, and yet in each case, people have rebuilt their lives. And I mean, a huge, huge amount. You chat to anyone of the generation who were forced to migrate, and they are some of the most resilient people that you'll ever meet. Also, some of the kindest, and the fact that you can be so kind of warm and sort of arms open wide whilst having gone through such traumas is utterly extraordinary. I think it's also taught me how much we all have in common. I know that every person who ever from Delhi gets the chance to visit Lahore is shocked by how much it's the exact same city. Yeah. And how emotional, and surprised by how emotional it is being there for the first time. And I know that, my friend Sinvir had exactly the same experience when he went back to Burma for the first time, where his family lived until the 1930s. I think that there is so much more than we realise that binds us all in common. And, I think Trump recently said, after this recent conflict in April, Trump was saying that India and Pakistan have been fighting over Kashmir for thousands and thousands of years. And I think it's strange when you do these interviews because you realise how recent all of these divisions actually are. The fact that they have happened within, the lifetimes of people who are still alive today, before which life was utterly different. And I think it's a reminder of how much hope we should all hold in some sort of reconciliation. And I know that everyone I know who's worked in partition research has always had the same view. People who don't are often surprised by how hopeful everyone who works between the two countries are at sort of some future rapprochement, despite all of the political challenges that it would take, these hurdles that it would take to jump over to get there. I think that there is still a huge amount more that binds us all together than we all realise.
I love that. on this very warm, positive note, are you ready for rapid fire?
Let's go.
If you could bring back one person from the 1940s into 2025, who'd handle the internet the best?
I feel Sarojini Naidu. I think that she was just amazing. I wasn't expecting it, but every time I went into her letters, she was just so badass and like kind of chatty. She felt a bit like a kind of, I can imagine her as like a chat show host or something, because she just constantly knows everyone's inner lives. Also amazing at just holding the world's political opinions in the palm of her hand and being able to kind of control the room whenever she enters it. She's arguably, I think, the most important woman in the entire freedom movement, but she is just so cool. And I wasn't expecting her to be as kind of pithy and brilliant as,
wow.
I can imagine her kind of running this kind of, amazing, one of those American late night shows or something.
God, not the answer I was expecting, but now I need to know more about her. Got it. Next book topic.
I think the best book that I wanted to read that I couldn't find was a really good biography of her. I think that's one of somehow the most important woman in the entire freedom movement still doesn't have a really good biography that's been written in the last 20 years. There are a bunch of, ones written 50, 60 years ago, but...
Any biographers listening, guys? You have multiple topic options that Sam has given us throughout this episode. Okay. One region or border in South Asia that fascinates you the most?
I think it was the India-Myanmar border. I think having spent so much time researching the India-Pakistan and India-Bangladesh borders, which are like the most militarized border fences in the world. You can see the India-Pakistan border from space in a way that you can't even see the Great Wall of China from space. And you get to the India-Myanmar border, and currently there is no border. And there is still this kind of strange sense of cross-border living that is still available to people who live in the area. And so, when I went there, the local kind of border security guards were like, oh yeah, you can cross over, just, make sure you remain in eyesight of us. And that's, I think, changing. Since I crossed over in 2021, I think that the increased, civil war and unrest in Myanmar is meaning that India's currently walling it up. But I think I think that region, the more that I began to research it, is central to all of the national conversations that we have in India today, and yet has always been sidelined. And it's definitely the bit that's fascinated me the most.
Wow. Maybe a second book? Focusing on that region?
Let's see.
Okay. What's a historical rumor that you secretly wish was true?
I'm just going to have to say the Nehru and Weena Mountbatten affair. I just feel that would be so salacious if true. Like
there was a lot happening.
There is a lot happening, but if if the British, if 250 years of British rule over India ends with the last viceroy of India having a relationship with the first Prime Minister of India, it is just perfect. And obviously we don't know. There are all sorts of letters. There's all sorts of proof. I have a lot of it in the book. But if true, chef's kiss.
You're very invested in this.
I am.
Okay. What's one tiny detail from the 1940s that you wish we still had today?
I feel like it's just going to be the ability to drive from Delhi, from Amritsar to Lahore for a picnic. I'm just going to say that.
Oh, fine. What is one book on the partition, other than your own, that you think everybody should read?
I feel like, obviously, Remnants by Anshul Malhotra, I have to say, on this podcast. But also because it's the book that basically inspired me to go down my whole journey of partition research. It was, I think, the first book that I read on the partition that introduced me to this subject. So,
all right, Remnants of Separation. What's one myth about the partition that you wish people would finally stop believing?
That it's something that happened in Punjab, as opposed to a cataclysmic event that transformed the entire region. I think the more research that is done on oral histories, the more that it's becoming clear that, it was, although most people died in Punjab, Punjab was the most violent because that's where the Indian army had mostly come from, and thus there were the most weapons in Punjab. Yeah. But the fact is that, as I mentioned before, Tripura is the most demographically changed. 3 times more refugees from what's now Telangana than are generated in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. The fact that there are huge numbers of people in Karachi today who migrated from what's now Chennai or Kochi, and as far south as that. The fact that some of the most affected cities by partition are in Assam and Meghalaya. And Mizoram. I think that this is far more of a pan-subcontinental event than we tend to realise.
I would agree. What's one historical what-if that keeps you up at night?
For this book, it's got to be, what if the Gulf had remained attached to India? Like, that's just a wild set of events, no? Like, what if the entire united GCC states were India's westernmost state?
Yeah. Okay.
Crazy.
Which historical figure would you ghost after one conversation?
I feel like you just got to pick who's the nastiest. Like who's because don't like ghosting people, but I think I'm gonna have to say, let's go with Aurangzeb. Just nasty dude.
Fair. All right. Sam, thank you so much for your time today. I think this was the perfect conversation for us to end our season on. The book is super informative, but I think I learned so much more during this interaction, and I'm so happy we can finally make it happen.
Well, thank you for having me.
Amazing. And for our listeners and viewers, I hope you liked this conversation. I hope you learned something from it. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for the reading list. We're going on break after this episode, but we're going to be back for season 2. Until then, go out, buy all the books that we've discussed so far. Specifically by this one, because Sam's going to be coming to Bahrisons to do a signing soon, so you want to have your copies. Thank you so much for your time. Bye.